So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to all of you. Today, as I said last week, we'll be going to take a look at the new coalition government in Israel. A government that, for the first time in a generation, is headed by someone else than Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party. And we're going also to look at what can be expected from such an unholy alliance, if you will, especially in the area of the Israeli-American relations. Well, let me first remind you very briefly, because we have been covering this issue abundantly in the past, how we got to this point. As you may remember, Israel has been through 4 parliamentary elections in the past, over the past 2 years, one every 6 months, if you will. With each of them basically ending up the same way, with Netanyahu's party coming out on top, but not decisively enough to form a coalition government with the other smaller and religious parties in order to reach the required majority of 61 seats in the 120-seat Israeli parliament or Knesset. At the other end of the spectrum, the various right-wing and left-wing parties, opposition parties, could not present a credible challenge to Netanyahu's leadership, as they ran in dispersed order, each one with its own political platform, its own political agenda, tailor-made for its own narrow political constituency. Now, with the possibility of the 5th election looming this summer, and election probably that would have had the same outcome as the previous 4, and with serious damage already inflicted on the country by 24 months of inaction, with no state budget for the past couple of years, which had serious implications, such as a freeze on economic development projects and social programs, with a caretaker prime minister who's facing trial for fraud, for breach of trust and corruption, not to mention the growing frustration of the Israeli public with the perceived inability of the political establishment to respond decisively to this long-standing stalemate. 2 political figures decided that it was high time to rock the boat, so to speak. Those 2 men are Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. Michelle, could you put up the photo, please, of these people? Thank you.
Is that it?
No, that is something else.
Did you send me more than one?
Yes.
One map today?
No, but it's not a map, it's a photo.
I don't think I got your other email. I only got this one. Let me just, when did you send the original one?
I sent it to you on Thursday night, I think, or Friday.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
No, this was a last moment addition.
No, you just sent me something, but I thought that was the only one. So
No,
let me just go back. Hold
sorry
on a
about
second. That's all right. You sent it too early.
that. Okay, so let's start with Lapid. I'm starting with Lapid because his contribution has been paramount in the unfolding of the events leading to the ouster of Netanyahu's led government. Lapid, who's 57, grew up in a secular and privileged environment in Tel Aviv.
Excuse me, Pierre. I don't have any other email from you this week or last week. So I never got them. I only got today's map 3, but I didn't get anything else.
Okay. Well, in that case, I'm not going to stop. I'll send it after the meeting, after we finish. After completing his mandatory army service, Lapid followed in his father's footsteps as a professional journalist and became a prominent member of the Israeli cultural establishment, balancing his column with a television talk show and even acting in a handful of movies, of television dramas and plays. He began planning for a political career in the early 2000s. And in 2012, Lapid formed his own centrist, secular political party called Yesh Atid, or There is a Future. His party unexpectedly took second place behind Netanyahu's Likud in a general election in 2013, and Lapid entered a Netanyahu-led coalition government as finance minister. But his ascent wasn't too long. As 2 years later, in a snap election, Lapid's party lost nearly half its seats. And as a result, Lapid lost his position and found himself on the political outs. That prompted him to take a step back and some time off, reducing his media appearances, improving his knowledge base, and quietly building a better political network. His first attempt to return to the political fray occurred in 2019, 2 years ago, before the third round of parliamentary elections in Israel, when he began discussing with a rival centrist leader and former Army General Benny Gantz the possibility of trying to oust Netanyahu. The two men joined forces within the Black and White party, but their alliance fell apart when Gantz changed his mind and rejoined instead a unity government led by Netanyahu. But Lapid did not give up. He knew that Netanyahu would only be defeated by a broad coalition of left-wing and right-wing parties, opposition parties. But he also recognized that some potential supporters of those right-wing parties would not support an alliance, a coalition led by a centrist like him. So very smartly, he not only refused to present himself as a prime minister, but he also let it known that he would be prepared to serve under a prime minister whose party got even fewer seats than his. If that was the price of unseating Netanyahu. And true to his word, Lapid offered Naftali Bennett, a right-wing former settler leader, whose party Yemina, or right word in Hebrew, only won 7 seats to Lapid's 17 in the last elections. He offered him the first shot at being prime minister, with Lapid taking up the post of foreign minister for the next couple of years. You know, the mandate of prime minister in Israel premiership is 4 years. After which, after the first couple of years, the two men would be switching positions. That issue taken care of, Lapid did not stop. And he continued to work behind the scenes to coax 6 other parties, left-wing and right-wing, into joining a large alliance against Netanyahu. As for his partner in crime, so to speak, Naftali Bennett, who is 49, he comes from a non-religious home in San Francisco. But in the spring of 1967, when Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, now if you can show the map that you have, Michelle, please. That's a map you just showed a couple of minutes ago. Thank you. You can see here the Strait of Tiran leading to the Israeli port of Eilat and to the Jordanian port of Aqaba. Here is the Suez Canal, and this is the Straits of Tiran. So when in the spring of 67, Egypt under Colonel Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran in a bid to choke off Israel. And the coalition of Arab states appeared massing for an offensive that would end Israel's lifespan of 19 years at the time. Bennett's parents, according to Bennett himself, were stunned that their Jewish American friends seemed unperturbed, continuing their everyday routines as the Jewish state existence hung in the balance. So when Israel prevailed in the 67 war, the Bennett family boarded the first commercial flight out of San Francisco and flew to Israel, where they settled in a kibbutz in Upper Galilee. Again, that was on the map that I thought I sent you on Thursday. It's in you cannot see it here. It's in the north of Israel, near the Lebanese Syrian border. No, it doesn't show on this map. Subsequently, the family moved to Haifa, which is a large port city on the Mediterranean, where Naftali, the youngest of 3 sons, was born in 1972. The difficulties of integration, however, proved to be too much, and the Bennetts returned to California the following summer. In October of that year, however, of 1973, another war broke out in the Middle East, the Yom Kippur War. Israel won again, but suffered heavy casualties. And the family moved back to Israel, this time for good. The family's religious awakening began slowly. And not in Israel, actually, but in Montreal first, and later in New York, where Naphtali's father was sent on behalf of the Jewish Agency. We started with simple things, like lighting candles on Sabbath Eve. One thing led to another until we all started to attend synagogue, and so on, said Bennett. As a teenager, he switched from co-ed public school to yeshiva, religious school. He then joined the army, where he commanded a company in a very mysterious high-tech unit operating deep behind enemy lines, and whose very existence was kept secret for decades. For several years during the army service, he went bareheaded. And it is only after Prime Minister Rabin's assassination by a Jewish extremist in 1995 that he returned to wearing the skull cap as he does today. That was a way for Bennett to protest against the anti-religious backlash triggered by this event in Israel at the time. Bennett's relatively lax religiosity is reflected in his personal life as well. His wife, a reputable chef, comes from a secular home. After the army, Bennett relocated again for a while to Manhattan this time, where he co-founded an anti-fraud software startup that he resold a few years later at a great profit. With his established reputation as a tech entrepreneur and elite unit commander with right-wing convictions, Bennett caught the attention of Netanyahu, who at the time was leader of the opposition. Bennett signed on as Netanyahu's chief of staff, distinguishing himself by his loyalty to the Likud leader. And after a few years of occupying various ministerial positions with varying degrees of success, Bennett was appointed in late 2019 defense minister. He only filled that position for 6 months when the coronavirus struck. He enlisted the military's full intelligence capabilities and continued the fight against the virus, even after leaving the government, building his own shadow corona cabinet, if you will, with a crew of medical, economic, and business experts, and even managed to publish a book on battling the epidemic. As a result, Bennett is probably the only Israeli politician to have gained political capital from the scope and timing of the pandemic. On the strength of his success, Bennett then joined Lapid in their effort to unseat Netanyahu. And the rest is history, as you know. Now, if I went into more detail than usual to describe these two people, these two leaders, it is because I want you to understand what drove them to enter such an unlikely alliance. an alliance that a vast majority of political pundits and experts had categorically ruled out only a few months earlier. As you can tell from what I said up to now, these two men had something in common. They both worked for and with Netanyahu at one time or another. And as such, they were both demeaned, abused, and publicly humiliated by him. Netanyahu not only succeeded in alienating the centrist party in Israel through personal attacks against Lapid and reneged on many promises made to the settlers, causing the anger and resentment of Bennett. But he also denounced the two leftist parties belonging to the current coalition as evil in disguise, strengthening the determination of the leaders of those parties to end his rule. Never has an Israeli politician played such a fundamental role in his own demise, or given a new coalition such huge incentive to keep him out of power. In other words, the wide-ranging opposition to Netanyahu was the primary catalyst in forming Israel's unprecedented new coalition government, and it may well be the strongest glue holding it together. But this being politics, Lapid's move to offer the premiership to Bennett first stems from motives less honorable than altruism or patriotism. Lapid gambles on the fact that if the coalition collapses and if new elections are called, then it is Bennett who may be punished by his right-wing base for having drifted away from Netanyahu, who is a fellow right-winger. And it is he, Lapid, who would likely emerge with his reputation intact and his electability enhanced for having placed the good of the country above his personal ambitions. And in the meantime, both men have something to prove. Bennett, as I said, a man of the right, has crossed the Rubicon by abandoning Netanyahu and Netanyahu's loyal right wing. And there is no turning back for him. Again, at age 49, he needs to make this administration a success if he wants a further career in politics. As such, he will have to preside over a less polarized, more functional political system where government is competent and can deliver. As for Lapid, he must prove that he can assume a larger political role than the Israeli public has been willing to let him play up to now. Aware of their weak points, the two men agreed that they have everything to win by promoting consensus and keeping disagreement under control. And just to make sure, they concluded a deal by which both have mutual vetoes on major issues. In other words, virtually ensuring the absence of dramatic legislation. No one will be asked to give up their ideology, but everyone will have to postpone the realization, Bennett said earlier this month. And if the new government can benefit from this period of respite by passing a 2-year budget, which again has been put off now since the first round of elections in Israel, then it may actually endure for some time. And there is plenty to do. Post-COVID-19 economic recovery, infrastructure development, and a better integration of the Israeli Arabs. Now, speaking of Israeli Arabs, their participation for the first time ever in an Israeli government through the Ram party and its leader Mansour Abbas, no relation to Mahmoud Abbas, who's the leader of the Palestinian Authority, represents an even greater challenge. Indeed, no more than a month after the worst communal violence between Israeli Arabs and Jews since the early 2000s, since the Second Intifada, or even since Israel establishment, Abbas has formally joined a government with parties that have in the past, particularly Bennett's party, discriminated against Palestinian citizens and prioritized interests of Jews over Arabs. Abbas is banking that through formal government participation, he can deliver much for his community, or at least gain more by joining a government than by boycotting it, as the Israeli Arabs have done ever since the creation of the State of Israel. Abbas knows very well that no matter how much credit the new Israeli government gets for dispatching Netanyahu, many Palestinians and their supporters see the new coalition as worse than the previous government, worse for their interests, because these Palestinians know that this new government cannot and will not address their core objectives. So Abbas negotiated the 4 seats that his party, the Ram party, won in the latest election to sign a deal with Lapid and Bennett that includes freezing the law that allows unauthorized settlement buildings until 2024, allocating unprecedented multi-year funding of $16 billion for the Arab community in Israel, and freezing all home demolitions in the Negev desert that you can see on the map here, the Negev desert in the south of Israel, for 9 months. Securing all this is the only way for Abbas to remain in the government. And yet, despite all the good intentions to avoid polarizing issues, the months-old coalition already suffered its first setback some 10 days ago, when it failed to muster a majority of lawmakers in the Knesset to extend a contentious law that effectively bans Israeli citizenship or permanent residency for Palestinians from the occupied territories who marry Israelis. Israeli officials argue that the law is necessary for security reasons, with some also acknowledging to some extent that it is a demographic tool to help Israel maintain its Jewish majority, while opponents of the law call it racist and discriminatory against the country's Palestinian Arab citizens. by denying them the basic freedom to marry whomever they choose and attain legal status for their spouses. That law that must be renewed every year was introduced in 2003 amid the violence of the Second Palestinian Uprising, or Intifada, and has been approved for the past 17 years with an almost automatic parliamentary majority. This time, however, some members of the diverse and fragile coalition refused to extend it. And one rebel member of Bennett's Yamina party even voted against the government. They were joined by the opposition Likud party and its ultra-Orthodox allies, who voted against extension in an effort to embarrass and destabilize the new government, even though they had supported extending the law every year in the previous 17 years. In reality, however, the failure to extend the citizenship law is not expected to have any dramatic or immediate impact on the thousands of families already affected by it, or on future unions, since it is the interior minister, who's a right-winger in Israel, in this new government, who has ultimately the authority to deny or to approve citizenship or residency to individuals on a case-by-case basis. Now, Netanyahu's departure is also a very lucky break for Joe Biden, even though the American president had long considered Netanyahu a friend, albeit one with whom he often disagreed. However, the ousted Israeli president was particularly disliked by Biden's immediate entourage and most congressional Democrats, who came to see him as a corrosive force and a de facto political ally of Republicans, including former President Trump. What's more, the change of government in Jerusalem occurs at a time when the White House is determined, as we saw earlier, to focus on domestic priorities and avoid spending energy on foreign policy issues, particularly those where it doesn't expect much return on investment. And certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict falls into that category. Although Washington considers Bennett as being more hardline than Netanyahu, it also believes that he will be forced to control his pro-settlement reflexes and avoid provocations in and around Jerusalem to hold the coalition together, number one, and to avoid an unnecessary conflict with Washington, number two. And while Bennett has opposed US re-entry into the Iran nuclear deal, it is not his signature issue as it was with Netanyahu. And he won't actively try to undermine the agreement. That's what Washington believes, as the former Israeli prime minister did by catering to Republicans and evangelicals. Already, Biden has signaled his desire to cooperate with the new Israeli leadership by meeting Israel's recent billion-dollar request for replenishing the Iron Dome, you know, the air defense missile system that proved its efficiency in the recent conflict in Gaza, and by promoting the Abraham Accords to other nations in the Middle East. The dilemma for the Biden administration will be to navigate an approach on the toughest issue of all, which is the future of Palestinians, in such a way that it doesn't press Jerusalem to harm, but yet manages to make some progress. Well, that cautious strategy is already under sharp criticism from progressive Democrats in Congress, particularly over Israel's occupation of the West Bank, which has prompted some of them to call for cuts to or limits on the sum $3.8 billion in military aid that the US provides Israel every year. And it is not only the Congress. The support for Israel among Democrats, generally speaking, has been dwindling quickly and dramatically as they are shifting towards the left. Bennett understands very well that the rising generation in the Democratic Party and among American Jews who overwhelmingly vote for it is rapidly diverging from its counterparts in Israel. So this is a context in which, after 12 years of uninterrupted Netanyahu presence, the Biden administration is called on to deal with a new and complex situation in the persona of Bennett, who is ideologically closer to Netanyahu, as we saw, than to Biden, who is a territorial maximalist, who believes in annexing 60% of the West Bank, and who is a staunch opponent to the two-state solution, which is still advocated by the Biden administration. I want the world to understand that a Palestinian state means no Israeli state. That's the equation, Bennett said recently. What cannot be any clearer? And yet, on the other hand, Bennett is not quite the extremist settler that he's made out to be. He speaks native level English, has a formidable military record, a sizable bank account from the successful tech startup, and a happy home with 4 children in a bourgeois neighborhood near Tel Aviv. He does not live in the West Bank. And early interaction between him and Biden suggests a shift in tone and an opportunity to establish a less contentious relationship with potential implications for dealing with Iran, the Palestinian, and the wider region. At the same time, however, any new burst of violence between Jews and Arabs within Israel, like the one that set off last month's Gaza's conflict, could test this budding relationship. As Bennett is a strong supporter of Israeli nationalists and settler groups, while Biden officials see them as an obstacle to peace, basically. So at the end of the day, the longevity of the new Israeli government will depend first and foremost on the relationship between Bennett and Lapid. Here the future looks somewhat promising. Bennett and Lapid have been cooperating against Netanyahu since 2013, and they have good personal chemistry. Unlike Netanyahu, Bennett is by all accounts collegial and has avoided the accusations of narcissism and paranoia that followed Netanyahu. if only because he can hardly afford it, with only 7 Knesset seats under his control. Close cooperation with Lapid, whose credibility has been on the rise over the past year, is thus a must for Bennett. So there is a good chance that the new coalition, sworn in on June 14th, a little over a month, will continue beyond what the skeptics predict, which is a very short time span. That being said, you can always count on something bad to turn up, particularly in that neighborhood in the Middle East. If there were another universe, the transition from the volatile and polarizing era of Netanyahu to one that's calmer, less chaotic, and competent at providing public services and better governance may endure. But this is our universe, and something disruptive and potentially coalition ending, either flowing from conflict with Palestinians or the contradictions within the government, which has not a strong core consensus, might be waiting around the corner. So obviously it's been only 6 weeks, but all we can do now is hope for the best. So this is where we stand today on the new Israeli government. All right, so I open the floor for your question, or you can just chat, put them on. Or unmute yourself, whatever.
I'm not sure.
Barbara, you're I heard your voice.
Yes, I was just thinking, I'm not sure how successful this government's going to be. It sounds like it's going to fall apart.
Anyway, Netanyahu, who obviously has not given up politics because he's
in the opposition.
That he's still on trial. So this issue is not behind him yet. So there is still a possibility and a threat that he might do jail time at some point. So he joined the opposition, obviously, and the coalition government has only 61 seats. Okay,
so it's a
the
bare
majority, as you can tell, the majority is very slim. It's 61 to 59.
Yeah, so he has a one seat.
So that's
lead.
very, yes, one of them defects and the whole coalition falls, or two of them defects and the government falls. And the government, so again, Bennett and Lapid are very aware of that. So this is the reasons why, as I mentioned in my presentation, they have signed this deal to be able to veto each other's
legislation.
I would say major legislation that mostly they don't mention it, but everybody knows that they have to do with West Bank and mostly with the Palestinians, the fate of the Palestinians. Not to mention that Abbas is always part of this coalition, and he cannot be seen vis-a-vis his own community, the Israeli Arabs, as someone who would sign on any type of legislation which the Palestinians would consider to be disadvantageous to them. So they have decided for the time being that's it, but that's very, if you will, it's extremely artificial. Okay, they decided not to deal with those issues as they did not exist, and that they would only deal with prioritized domestic issues, where they have done relative with the COVID issue and the budget issue, which are contentious to some extent, but where deals can be
negotiated.
Okay.
Yeah.
But to leave aside the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Now, it so happens that in that respect, they happen to be lucky, and also the Biden administration's timing is also lucky, because as you know, the Biden administration does not want any part of the Israeli-Palestinian issue for now.
Yeah.
Because Biden realizes very well, after all, let's not forget, he was vice president
and
8 years. He realizes that, and under his watch to some extent, the Obama administration and John Kerry in particular, who was Secretary of State at the time, worked for 2 years in this shuttle diplomacy to try and find a solution to the conflict. And he gave up in 2014. And since 2014, there have been no meetings between Palestinians and Israelis. So in 2021, today, Biden as president has made sure, when he went to the White House, that the Israeli-Palestinian issue would definitely not be on his priority agenda for the time being. And even when the war broke out in Gaza for 11 days, if you will, the United States did not get directly involved in the conflict. When I say involved diplomatically in the conflict, they went through the Egyptians and the Saudis to convince the Hamas to stop bombing. And also Qatar, because Qatar, as you know, Qatar is the only Arab Gulf country which provides support, financial support to Hamas in Gaza. So they convinced Hamas to stop the
bombing,
sending rockets into Israel. That's how the fighting stopped, but not really through the direct intervention of the United States. Although the Secretary Blinken met with Lapid in Europe once, and Biden met with the outgoing president of Israel, Rivlin, before Rivlin left his post in May. But the United States tried as much as possible to stay out of the conflict, and instead involved Egypt, in particular, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, into finding a solution to the fight, at least to stop fighting for the time being. So, in a way, the Israeli agenda and the American agenda are simple. Not to do anything about the Palestinian-Israeli issue, because basically there is nothing to do.
There's no answer.
There is no answer, and not only that, but even because what the Obama administration pushed, they were pushing the two-state solution. Now, today, 70 or 75 of the Israeli population, according to polls, does not believe any longer in the feasibility of a Palestinian state next to Israel. And the same, more and more, I mean, for the Palestinians themselves, they believe less and less in the possibility of having a two-state solution, considering how much of the West Bank is already occupied by Israeli settlers. So there is no solution, okay, for now.
Okay.
So the United States and Israel have decided that for the time being, nothing can be done. And as a matter of fact, as you can tell, the new administration in Washington hasn't done much more than the previous Trump's administration in the Middle East. He kept everything the same way. In other words, the American embassy is still in Jerusalem, and it will not be moved. The two-state solution is not pushed. The Abraham Accords that Trump achieved are being pushed actually and promoted by the Biden administration to other countries in the area and the Muslim countries in Africa. So basically nothing has changed except for a few, but the United States agreed to start paying the UNRWA, which is the United Nations Agency for refugees in the Middle East, in other words, for the Palestinians. And the United States agreed to the reopening of a Palestinian mission in Washington, which had been closed by Trump.
Okay.
And maybe the reopening of a American sort of mission in Jerusalem for Palestinian issues. Not the American embassy in Israel, but a small mission next to it for Palestinians to deal with Palestinian issues, visas and things like that.
Yeah, that's all functional things.
But that's all functional thing, but basically, substantively, like in many other ways, if you come to think of it, Barbara, there have in the past 6 months anyway, since Biden took over in the White House, when you look at his foreign policy, the tone has changed, but the substance has not. Nothing has changed when I compare it to the Trump administration. Nothing. When you look at to China, the tariffs imposed by Trump are still there. Okay.
Yeah.
The tariffs imposed by the United States in Europe have been lifted on some items, but they are still
there.
Other items. Again, the tone has changed, but nothing much.
But the substance is the same.
So in many areas in which last year at this time, Biden has promised to make substantial changes compared to the Trump administration. As I always told you, everybody here, the campaign promises, you have to be very, very careful about what might turn into reality and what is just a promise. The foreign policy of the administration has not changed.
But the tone has.
It's still the same. And the Middle East probably is more so than any of this issue. Because again, all the people surrounding the entourage of Biden is exactly the same as it was the entourage of first
Obama,
Hillary Clinton, and then
Obama,
John Kerry. It's exactly the same people. Sullivan, Blinken, they were all there for the Iran nuclear deal, for the Israeli-Palestinian talks, and so on. So they believe exactly. They tried 8 years or 4 years or 5 years ago, before the Trump administration. They tried. They failed. They don't want to fail again. So they won't try.
So they won't say anything.
They won't try because there is nothing for now. There is nothing to talk about. I mean, the situation is where it is, frozen. The situation is where it is, and neither side believes that that the other one will move in any shape or fashion. So it's frozen.
Thank you.
That's my take anyway on what's going on in the Middle East. So this new government in Israel is lucky in that respect, because its agenda with the Palestinians matches the Biden's
The
agenda,
Biden agenda.
which is, let's not do anything. Let's do everything to keep it the way it is, okay? To keep the cover
The status
over what's
quo.
going on, and let's not rock the boat or make waves. And if we have a local conflict like with Gaza for 11 days, let's just limit it locally. It's all right to send a few missiles here and there, or to bomb Gaza, as long as it's limited. And that's exactly what you see
We're
what's
doing.
going on. You have not seen any Arab state. Try to think about it, Barbara. For instance, 10 years ago, a war between the Palestinians in Gaza and Israelis would have created an outcry in the
Oh,
Arab world,
absolutely. Huge.
all over the governments, you know.
Yeah, huge.
Demonstration in the streets, burning the Israeli flag,
Huge. Yes.
asking the governments to go to war with Israel. Today, as you could see, after what happened in Gaza, nothing.
Nothing. Nothing.
Nothing. All the governments in the Middle East dissuaded their people one way or the other, because it's better not to look how they do it, but that's another story, okay? You look the other way. Dissuaded the people to do anything in that respect. So Gaza came and went, all right? It was limited. And as such, it was a success for the United States, because Biden and his administration doesn't have to go there.
Yeah, they don't have to go to war.
Nor does the Russians, nor does it was perfect for everybody, because the Russians are in Syria, and the last thing they want is to have problems with the Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is next to Syria, or to have jihadists fighting in the area. And going to Syria also and fighting the Russians, obviously. So for the Russians, it worked out perfectly well as well. How much of an influence the Russians had in the area, I don't know. But I'm sure that...
I'm sure they were there.
I'm sure that they put pressure on al-Assad to keep the Syrians also quiet.
I'm sure.
So here we are today on the Middle East. And this is why I'm telling you that in that respect, the Israeli government is lucky, because they came at the time when the Palestinian issue is not an issue. And as you very well know, this is a very long answer, but it calls for a very long answer. As I mentioned in my presentation, Netanyahu wasn't focusing either on the Palestinian issue. Netanyahu's focus was on the Iranian deal, and has been now for the past 2 or 3 years, as you know. Well, the Iranian deal for this new government is not its signature deal. So again, neither Bennett nor Lapid will do anything like Netanyahu to come here to the United States, invited by the Republican Party, and to speak in front of the
Congress
against the Democratic Party, which is in the White House. They won't do that. They might put pressure. Obviously, Bennett is against absolutely 120% against the deal. And he already told Blinken in no uncertain uncertain terms and very undiplomatically that if it has to, Israel would go it alone to take care of the Iranian issue if it comes to it. And the Americans know it. And probably, as I said last week, I believe, this is a seventh round of indirect talks in Vienna between the Americans and the Iranians through the intermediaries, so the other signatories of that deal, that the Americans are consulting the Israelis or are consulting with the Israelis or are informing the Israelis of what's going on in Vienna. That being said, what I'm reading and what I'm hearing also is that contrary to what I said about Iran last week and the fact that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, was pushing for a deal before Rouhani, the president, the outgoing president, leaves in mid-August, there will be no deal. Before the new president, Raisi, comes in mid-August. There will be no deal because there is still, they cannot agree on a number of points. I don't know which, but there are a number of points on which they are still separated. So it seems now that the supreme leader gave up on that wish of having a deal signed before, even though Iran, again, needs its sanctions lifted as soon as possible because they are in a dire economic situation, really. But it seems that there will be no deal signed before Rouhani leaves office in mid-August. And then we see what happens. Because, again, Iran will have a hardline government in place with a hardline president in place.
Yes.
So how many concessions can such a government make to the United States? And it will have to make concessions. If they want a deal, it will have to make concessions. There is always a way. There is always a way. You can always, if you are the Americans, you can always sign a deal to go back to the previous deal, okay? On condition that you sit down as soon as the deal is signed and you work on the new one. There is always a way. And you promise to come back to the negotiating table and to sign a deal, but you promise in writing. So you cannot say after there was a misunderstanding. You come back and sign. Because the sanctions can be lifted, but they can be reimposed also the next day. And if they are reimposed, they can be much harder than what they are now. So there is always, diplomatically, there is always a way to if there is a will, there is a way to do it. But it remains to be seen if the Americans perceive the new Iranian government as willing to make concessions. So
Thank you.
So as long as the Israelis haven't heard from the Americans as what's going on with the Iranian deal, obviously they wait.
Yeah, they haven't heard.
But again, the Palestinian issue now is under the doormat for the time being. It's pushed under the rug because there is no issue. Now Israel is concentrating, like under Netanyahu, to having more states, Arab states in the Gulf, sign the Abraham Accords with them. And they're working actually already exchanges between, bless you, between the United Arab Emirates and Israel have been, there have been many delegations from the Emirates to Israel, and many entrepreneurs and businessmen, Israeli businessmen, to the Emirates to sign deals in the technological area and in the area of even they talking about digging a pipeline between the
Yeah, I
Arab
read that.
Emirates and Israel, and so there is a beginning of serious cooperation. It's not like signed a piece of paper like Israel did, if you will, with Egypt and Jordan. They have peace treaties, but those peace treaties, they mean only lack of hostility, okay? But there is not a lot of commercial exchanges between those two Arab countries and Israel. It is also true that Egypt and Jordan are poor. I mean,
Yeah.
they are not oil producers,
not.
and they are not oil rich, or they have everything to gain from a cooperation with Israel.
With Israel.
They don't have much to give to give back in exchange. So there is lack of hostility, okay, between those three countries. But I wouldn't say that there is a lot of cooperation and exchange. With the Emirates, and Bahrain, that's a different proposition. They have something to offer in exchange of Israeli's technology, which is one of the top technologies in the world.
In the world, yeah.
So, all right, it's been a little long, but it deserved a long answer. Anything else? I don't see any questions here on the chat. Anything else about anything?
There's a question.
Yes.
Pierre?
Yes. Hi, Don.
How you doing?
All right.
How much of a problem is Syria that's going to remain under Assad's control and having, forces backed by the Iranians? Netanyahu had done, preemptive strikes against some of those forces. Will the new administration in Israel do the same? Or is just Syria so devastated by its civil war that, fighting with Israel is sort of on the back burner until they get their own country straightened out?
Well, in a way, Don, you're answering your own question, which is fighting with Israelis is the last thing that al-Assad wants to do, or even if he wanted to just distract the public opinion from what's going on in Syria, they will not do, for many reasons. The first one is domestic. Do not forget that al-Assad is still not ruling over the whole of his country. There are still parts of Syria which are under the administration, so to speak, of the Turks. And on one side, Russia took over. Well, they don't administer it, but basically, for all intents and purposes, they cut out a part of Syria on the Mediterranean, where they have the naval base. And there are also, as you mentioned, some Iranian troops, which are essentially deployed on the Golan Heights, because they want to be, number one, closer to Israel, and number two, closer to the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Obviously, Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militia, and which basically has been running Lebanon, because the Hezbollah, its armed militia, is much stronger than the Lebanese army. So they have been running the country for 2 years, and as a result, Lebanon has no government either. for the past 2 years, because even though the French came to Lebanon and Macron urged the Lebanese leaders to, you remember the explosion of last year on August 4th in the port of Beirut when 200 or 300 people died, and some of the city was leveled. The French came in and told the Lebanese to get their things together and form a coalition government if they want international donors to come in and help them reconstruct the country. Well, nothing has been done because one of the conditions for the Christians and for the Sunnis was get rid of the Shiites and of Hezbollah and get them out of the government if a government were to be formed. Obviously, the Hezbollah said there's no way. We are the strongest, not party, because the Shiites are a minority in Lebanon, but militarily speaking, again, they are stronger than the Lebanese army. So there is not much that the Lebanese government could do against Hezbollah. So for all intents and purposes, the Shiites have been running Lebanon for the past year. And as a result, no government has been formed in Lebanon. And as you might have seen a couple of days ago, Hariri was supposed to be the prime minister, or was anyway charged by the president, Aoun, to form a new government. He's a third or fourth Lebanese figure, politician, who said, there is no way I can form a government since there is no way for us to find any type of agreement with Hezbollah, which has its own agenda. So the Iranians are on the Golan Heights, again, close to Israel and also close to Hezbollah, whom they help financially and militarily. So al-Assad is not in any position at all to start fighting with Israel. And as a matter of fact, he has no reason to go to war with Israel. Over what? I mean, he definitely is one of the Arab leaders who has no reason to go into any type of conflict. Now, that's number one. Militarily, Assad practically, whatever he has left as an army, he sends it out to fight the jihadists or the militias that still oppose him in Lebanon, in Syria. There are still some left. So, and he doesn't know exactly how he's going to reconstruct the country, because for all intents and purposes, Aleppo, for instance, or other places in Syria have been destroyed. 80% of the infrastructure is not working anymore in Lebanon. Therefore, the refugees do not come back from Turkey, for instance, which has 4 million of them, or 3.5 million, nobody knows. Not to mention all the European countries, which took in a number of Syrians. So all these people cannot come back home as long as there is nothing to come home to. And as long as there is still fighting going on. It's not in the newspapers every day because it's not wide range fighting, if you will, like when the ISIS was occupied some of the Syrian land, but there is still fighting. So Assad, who depends on the Iranians and particularly on Russian assistance to stay where he is, he will not go into any adventure against Israel, especially that the Russians wouldn't let him. As much as the Iranians might push him to do something, the Russians would tell him, you don't do anything because we are here and we don't want to be the casualties of any Israeli airstrikes in Syria. We have our own interests in Syria. They don't coincide with yours. So you just keep your nose out of whatever is happening. Just concentrate on just staying in power and do not get involved. But this is kind of advice that he doesn't even know. He needs. He knows. So Syria, if your question is whether Syria is a threat to Israel at this time,
no.
The answer is definitely no. This is not going to happen, and for a very long time, considering the state in which Syria is in. Sherry?
Yeah, Pierre. First of all, I just want to let you know that it doesn't look like the chat is working.
Why don't you show yourself?
Oh, I can do that.
I can only see your name on the screen.
Okay. Here I am.
Ah, here you are. Hi.
Hi. Okay. Okay. The chat doesn't seem to be working. I tried to put something in chat, and it's just like I can't even make it go. But anyway, so I wanted to get back to Israel, and you had talked about.
We never left it.
Well, yeah. Well, sort of.
We went to the neighboring countries.
We went to the neighboring countries. I'm going back to the coalition.
Okay.
The coalition government. Okay. So it seems to me that, already they've taken a few missteps. For example, with the settlement, the West Bank settlement, Eviatar, where they, it was an illegal settlement. They agreed to dismantle it. And instead of just dismantling it, I believe they're now going to turn it into an Israeli military base, which is, just, it's like, okay, what did that accomplish? Then yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, they cleared the Al-Aqsa Mosque area so that some Jewish tourists could.
You mean in Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem, yeah. I mean, I don't understand why they're doing these things. These things are just, hearkening back to some of the provocative things that Netanyahu did, and I don't understand why they're doing this.
Well, you did, Sherry, to some extent. Well, do not forget, number one, who Bennett is. So that should not surprise you. I mean, this is the least that Bennett can do to prove to his whatever base he has, because he has very little base. I mean, he has only a few people who turned away from Netanyahu, and not for political reasons they turned away from Netanyahu. They turned away from Netanyahu because of the Netanyahu fatigue, 12 years as prime minister, even for some people who are not loyal supporters of Netanyahu was enough. So they said, let's give Bennett a chance. But Bennett, as I mentioned in my presentation, has only 7 seats in the Knesset.
Right.
He represents basically nothing out of 120. Okay, so, but he's a leader of the settlers on the West Bank. So you can expect that some limited measures would be taken by this new government, as long as they don't too far, and as long as there is a limited reaction from the Palestinian side, which you can never evaluate really. You don't know exactly what will you said provocative. I think that Bennett and his people are smart enough to know what's provocative and how far they can go, okay? I don't know exactly the details of what's going on, Now turning a settlement on the West Bank into military base, I haven't seen that, but if you say so.
That's what was reported in Al Jazeera.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, I don't know if Al Jazeera is exactly
Yeah, I
source
know.
of information where I.
But I've heard from other sources that it's that even though they removed the settlers, Israel is still not giving up. They're not destroying the place. They're not handing it back to the
I understand.
Palestinians.
I
They're
understand.
not letting them have their olive groves
I
back.
understand, but you also have to understand that Bennett and this coalition never made any promise to the Palestinians to give back lands in the West Bank. They freeze, as I mentioned to you, they freeze the settlements where they are for now.
But this one was a very recent settlement.
Yeah, but it was recent. But this government is even more recent.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You know, it was recent. I agree with you in time, but it was still under the Netanyahu's government. This is recent, but nothing like this happened under Bennett yet. So why they turn it into a military base, or is there a need to turn it into a military base, or did they turn already some of these settlements into military base previously? I don't know. So this might be one move that was done, made before in other areas of the West Bank. I don't know. As for the neighborhood in Jerusalem, whether this neighborhood was in majority occupied by Arabs or Israelis, I don't know either.
Oh, it wasn't the neighborhood. It was the Dome of the Rock. They cleared.
Oh, okay, all right.
They
When you
cleared
say
the Muslims.
they cleared the area. They cleared
for Jewish tourists. It just happened. I mean, it's just like, what?
Yeah,
well, something like that.
I will see. We'll see what is the reaction of the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and what is the reactions of Hamas. Okay.
Yeah, I just, what's concerning is if these kinds of actions keep occurring, everything is going to go back to where it was. That's the fear.
But again, as I said as I tried to make it clear in my presentation, this government, when you look at the government and what is made of, I mean, it's very artificial to decide that you're not going to, as I mentioned to Barbara before, that you're not going to deal with the Palestinian issue at all, and to concentrate only on focus on domestic issues. Things do not work like that, because especially in foreign policy, where there are issues that come from the outside over which you have no control whatsoever. So obviously you don't want to deal with these issues, but these issues will end up dealing with you. So you have to, if you don't want to be proactive, which I can understand in order to keep this government together, you have to react to this, to whatever issues come from the outside. And this is when we're going to see how much this government could stay together. Because this government, in addition to Lapid and Bennett, has also left-wing parties.
Yeah.
The Meretz and the Labour Party, which are very small, I agree with you, and they joined the coalition partly because, again, they wanted to get rid of Netanyahu, but partly also because they realized that if they do not join the coalition, they go into oblivion.
Yep.
They represent very few people nowadays in Israel, as the Israeli public opinion, basically, like in many countries in Europe, Western Europe, and the United States, tend to turn to the right today, more than to the left. So with all these illiberal, quote unquote, governments in Europe and the populist governments in Europe. So these left-wing parties have been consulted also before any of these steps were taken by the coalition, again, to see how far they can go, okay? And then, as I said at the end, we hope for the best, that we will stay together. In the meantime, obviously, and he's playing his role, Netanyahu does everything in his position to get rid of this government and to call for new elections. So this was celebrating as a thing of getting rid of Netanyahu, which they did. For how long? That remains to be seen. And how this trial of Netanyahu will develop, that's another thing that we have to take into account. That we'll need to see. Because he was able up to now to postpone really his trial up to now. And his hope was to be able to postpone it indefinitely because he was hoping to be able to form a new government, or if not, to call for the fifth election. But that did not work out. So what Netanyahu is trying to do is to sabotage this government as much as he can, particularly the lawmakers who are in the Yemina party or in the Bennett's party, telling them to, they've been under incredible pressure in Israel. You don't realize that the Likud posted their names and phone numbers and addresses for the right wing to go to their places and demonstrate in front of their personal, their houses, to put pressure on them to come back to the Likud, to vote for the Likud. And these ones were the ones who were, in a way, brave enough to not to be pressured into it. But for all intents and purposes, these 7 lawmakers of Yemina parties are considered as traitors by the Likud and by Netanyahu. So is Bennett. And Bennett knows very well that if his government collapses, he's done. He's done politically. There is nowhere for him to go because Netanyahu will never forget what he considers to be. He considers him a traitor to the right wing. Let's not forget Bennett is the settlers' leader, and as such, I remember when Netanyahu was coming to the United States, and he was told that to freeze the settlements on the West Bank, while Bennett back home was pushing for annexing more and more and more territories. And when Trump came up with a peace plan, the American peace plan for the West Bank, in which, as you know, some of these territories were to go to Israel. After negotiation with the Palestinians, Bennett was totally opposed to it. And he said, anyway, there will be no Palestinian state. Therefore, there is nothing, we should be occupy Judea and Samaria, right? Without any type of concessions to the Palestinians, because there will be no Palestinian state. I, Bennett, do not recognize a Palestinian state next to ours, because that would be a stepping stone for the Arabs to attack us eventually and to destroy us. So I remember Bennett making this kind of statement. The only reason probably he's holding back now is because that's the only way to keep this government together. Because if he made this kind of statement tomorrow, he's done. I mean, he's done. The whole government is blown up. So this is where we are today. It's there. The government is still there 6 weeks later. Nobody even expected this government to last this long. But as you said, every time there is that a step or a measure taken, which might seem controversial, or then the next question is, what if there is a vote in the parliament? And what will the left wing parties say? And what will Abbas, Mansour Abbas say? So that's where we stand today. That's why we pretend that the Palestinians do not exist. The Palestinian issue does not exist for now, and you look somewhere else. The budget, coronavirus, which is a real issue for most Israelis also, because there have been a spike also in Israel in the number of cases recently. I mean, it's like all over the place. It seems that there is a new variant. So with a new variant, there are more cases, and the hospitals again are getting more patients. So again, we're getting into this vicious circle so everybody has other issues to look at, without realizing that, realizing it, that the Palestinian issue is going nowhere. I mean, the Palestinians are still there, and their future will have to, at some point, be addressed. How and when? Is it going to be in our lifetime, or is it going to be? There was this joke in Israel, for 2,000 years in the diaspora, the Jews said next year in Jerusalem for 2,000 years, right? So it is the turn of the Palestinians to say that, So this is it's a bad joke, but it says what it says, right?
Yeah.
So
thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? If there's anybody left, yes, there are still some people left. Any other questions on any subjects that? By the way, I think next week we'll be addressing the Haitian issue for two reasons. Number one, because what's going on in Haiti, and number two, because I realized that we never spend any time on that unfortunate country. So maybe we're going to go to the Caribbean next week for our presentation. Anything else? Anything else? Okay, there are a couple of questions. One is anonymous. Do you believe Iran is becoming more of a threat to Israel as things stand now, with obtaining a nuclear weapon? Well, obviously, if they have a nuclear weapon, they will be definitely, if nothing else, even if they have no intention of bombing Israel with nuclear weapons because they know that in that case, they are not suicidal. They know in that case they face extermination. It is definitely a deterrent for not only for the Israelis, but for any other state, including the Sunni states in the area, to attack Iran. So it definitely having a nuclear bomb is a plus for the Iranians. Do I believe that even if they had a bomb, they'd be using it? Again, I have doubts because once again, it would be suicidal on their part to do something like that. Not to mention what they do to the whole area. And despite everything that is said about the Iranians, they are not crazy. They know perfectly well what they are doing. So yes, as a deterrent, definitely the Iranians would be in a better position to project themselves as and that's what they want, basically, in my opinion, more so than use a bomb, is to have the bomb and to be able to use that bomb again as a deterrent with the other countries in the area and cement their place as a influential country in the Middle East, on the same level, they would say, as Israel. So we'll see. Mark, hi Mark. There'll be a lot of unrest in South Africa. Yes, there have been a lot of unrest in South Africa. There's been a lot of unrest in Haiti. There have been unrest in a number of countries. They are unrelated, and South Africa, I guess, unlike Haiti, this unrest has not been politically motivated, if you will, but have more to do with the inaction of the South African government. And to some extent, some people say it's incompetence in dealing with a virus, particularly. Very few people had been vaccinated in South Africa up to now. And also the fact that because of the virus, the economy went into a tailspin, and so the economic situation seems to be worsening over there. So that's the reason for the unrest. Now, we'll see what the South African government will do to bring some kind of solutions to the medical crisis and to the economic repercussion. Anything else? All right. Anything else once? Anything else twice? All right. In that case, if we run out of questions and you know all there is to know about the new government in Israel. Then I want to wish you a very nice week, and hope to see you all next Monday on our charter to Port-au-Prince in Haiti. Have a nice week.